This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Scion, and today I'm bringing you the first video in my limited review for Innistrad Midnight Hunt. Spooky season comes early this year as the new set was fully revealed earlier today, and that means over the next week or so I'll be putting out a limited review video every single day. Set review time is always a lot of fun, but this is the set I've been the most excited about in years, so I'm looking forward to sinking my teeth in to all of these new cards. This time around, we're beginning with a look at the cards that are multicolored and colorless, as well as lands, which are also colorless. In the past, I've gone through the set in Wooburg order, but for my Forgotten Realms set review, I did things a little bit differently. This is because they only gave us like 2 days between the full reveal of the set and it being available on Arena, so I had to crank everything out in a hurry, and I did it in 3 videos instead of 6. Luckily, this time around, they gave me ample time to get the review done before it's on Arena, but one of the pieces of feedback I got was that many of you liked that I started with multicolored since it gave you a feel for the archetypes and stuff like that. So that's where we're starting this time around. In these reviews, I give my initial thoughts about how the cards in the set will perform in the limited format. I use a letter grade system to sum up my thoughts on each of these cards. If you aren't familiar about what my grades mean, there is an explanation in the description. Alright, let's get started with the set review for Innistrad Midnight Hunt. First up, we've got Angel Fire Ignition, which for 1 generic, a red and a white is a rare sorcery, and it says put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature. It gains Vigilance, Trample, Lifelink, Indestructible, and Haste until end of turn, and Flashback is back in this set, and that means you can cast a card for its Flashback cost from your graveyard and then exile it, and in this case the Flashback cost is 2 generic, a red, and a white. This is pretty sweet. It isn't a combat trick because it's a sorcery, but when you find a window to cast this, it's going to make any creature you use it on into a big problem. Even if your opponent can just block the creature, it is indestructible and has lifelink, so you'll get some value, and that's the fail case here. Frequently, it will make a creature into a much bigger problem. And then you can flash it back, so the nightmare isn't over for your opponent. You do have to be careful about when you want to use this to avoid getting 2-for-1, but if you do it at the right time, the ceiling is pretty insane. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Arcane Infusion, which for a blue and a red is an uncommon instant. It says look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal an instant or sorcery card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order, and it has flashback for 3 generic, a blue, and a red. This one was my preview card. Anyway, this is one of Blue-Red's signpost uncommons, and it tells you that you want to jam a ton of instants and sorceries into your deck. If you can do that, you end up with something pretty nice. If you can't do that, this will be pretty ugly, because you can't really afford to whiff with it on either activation. Still, getting 10-ish spells is doable, especially in Blue-Red. Over the course of the game, you can end up getting a 2-for-1 thanks to the flashback too. I think this is probably just a C. I could give it a build-around grade, but I think that blue-red decks will naturally find themselves with the right composition often enough that we don't need to go there. It definitely isn't the kind of signpost that pulls you into the color pair though, and it's more of a role player. Next up, we have our first double-faced card in the set, which they feature pretty massively in this set as they do when we visit Innistrad, and in this case, it's Arlinn the Pack's Hope on the front. She's 2 generic, a red and a green, for a 4 loyalty planeswalker, Arlinn, and she's of course mythic rare. She's got Daybound, and it says if a player casts no spells during their own turn, it becomes night next turn. I'm going to elaborate a little more on Daybound versus Nightbound in a second, so for now though, let's just get through the card. Her +1 says, until your next turn you may cast creature spells as though they had flash, and each creature you control enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it, and she has a -3 that says create 2 2/2 green wolf creature tokens. The other side is Arlinn the Moon's Fury, and it has Nightbound, and it has a +2, and you can add red and green to your mana when you do that, and she has a 0 loyalty ability that makes her into a 5/5 werewolf creature with trample, indestructible, and haste. So, like I said, let's take the time to look at day and night here, because it's going to come up a lot in this set review. It is somewhat involved, so I'm only going to cover it this one time across all these videos, but I will of course point people back to this one in later videos. So it will be neither night nor day until you play a card with Daybound or a card that otherwise states that it becomes day, and there are a few of those. When you do play one of those, it becomes day, and for the rest of the game, it will shift between night and day depending on what players do. It will become night if a player doesn't cast any spells during their turn, and it can shift back to day if a player casts 2 spells on their turn. If you played an Innistrad set before, you'll notice that this is kind of similar to how werewolves transformed in those sets, but there's one key difference here, and that is whether it's day or night actually affects which side of the card comes into play first. So, unlike in old sets, if it's night and you play a double face card, the back side can actually enter play first if it's the nightbound side. This means that you can get some really good deals on werewolves and some other cards, which are crazy efficient when they start out in their nightbound mode. One thing to keep in mind, though, that is a bit unintuitive, not all double-face cards in this set are Daybound and Nightbound, so don't make that mistake. Many of them are more traditional and just transform and you meet some requirement. Alright, now that I've explained that, let's get back to Arlinn. Both sides of this card are great for 4 mana, but I actually think the Daybound side here might be the better one, and that's not true of very many cards in the set. The daytime side here is really great for only 4 mana. Even if all you do with her is make 2 2/2 wolf tokens, you're kind of doing alright. And what's great is she can come down and make those wolf tokens to protect her, and that will often be enough for you to start using the +1 effectively, since you'll have the mana to do it on your next turn. And that +1 is pretty real, and really gives your opponent a hard time. Also, it can help transform her, since you can just use her +1 on your turn and pass, at which point she enters werewolf mode. But yeah, I do think the werewolf side here is actually a little less impressive. The ramp is nice, and the ability to rumble as a 5/5 is good too, but the wolf token making ability is probably the most powerful ability on the card. Still, she can shift between the two sides pretty effectively, as the mana the Moon's Fury side gives you can help you double spell. You can also potentially use that +2 on your next turn, transform her again, and then make some more wolves. So the whole package here is definitely a bomb. I'm giving her an A. Next up, it's Blade Stitch Scab, which for a blue and a black is a 2/3 zombie soldier at uncommon, and it says other zombies you control get +1/+0. So, obviously, this is one of blue-black signpost uncommons, and it tells you that the core theme for the deck is zombies. This is an efficient zombie lord, and this set has a lot of zombies, so it'll be great in blue-black decks. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Can't Stay Away, which for a black and a white is a rare sorcery, and it says return target creature card with mana value 3 or less from the graveyard to the battlefield. It gains if this creature would die, exile it instead, and you can pay a flashback cost of 3 generic, a white, and a black to cast it from your graveyard. So, 2 mana to reanimate a 3 mana creature isn't too bad, but the problem is that you won't always have something worth reanimating. It has flashback, which is nice, and also means it further synergizes with the graveyard deck. It also means it can ultimately give you a 2-for-1, albeit very slowly. I don't think this is anything special, but it's certainly a card you'll run in most of your black-white decks. It just requires a little bit of setup and really isn't that efficient even when you get it going. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Corpse Cobble, which for a blue and a black is an uncommon instant, and it says, as an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice any number of creatures, create an XX blue and black zombie creature token with Menace, where X is the total power of the sacrificed creatures, and it has flashback for 3 generic, a blue, and a black. Giving up a creature for another creature, or several creatures for one creature, isn't something that is super appealing to me. Now, this does combo pretty well with the zombie tokens in the set. We haven't seen any of them yet, but they're all weakened versions of tokens because they're 2/2s that can't block, and when they attack, they die at the end of combat. And this combos really well with them because you can sort of take full advantage of their 2/2 bodies even after they attack by sacrificing them to this and then getting one big zombie that doesn't have decay and that has menace. And this is also an instant, so you can sacrifice a big thing your opponent is removing and get a big creature again, which will feel pretty nice. All of that means this is a solid card, but I'm a bit skeptical this will be the kind of blue-black card that really puts you into the color pair. The whole all my eggs in one basket thing just isn't super appealing. It is pretty nice, and it's definitely going to win games, and I'm giving it a decent grade, but I don't think it's a card that pulls you into the color pair either, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Croaking Counterpart, which for 1 generic, a green and a blue is a rare sorcery, and it says create a token that's a copy of target non-frog creature, except it's a 1/1 green frog, and it has flashback for 3 generic, a green, and a blue. This is a fun card and a nice callback to Cackling Counterpart, however, it's not incredible and limited. 3 mana to make a 1/1 copy of a thing will sometimes feel okay, like if a creature has a bunch of abilities, but there will be plenty of times where paying 3 for that 1/1 doesn't accomplish much other than making a chump blocker. Even with flashback, I don't see this lining up really well regularly enough to be a good card. It certainly has a high ceiling, one that's dependent though on what's in play, but the floor is pretty ugly. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Dawnheart Wardens, which for 1 generic, a green, and a white is a 3/3 human warlock and uncommon. It's got vigilance, and it has a new ability word that debuted in this set called Coven, And what that means is if you have creatures in play with 3 or more different powers, as in, power and toughness, that power, you get some kind of effect. And in this case, at the beginning of combat, your creatures all get +1/+0 until end of turn if you meet the Coven requirement. So a 3-mana 3/3 is a great baseline, especially with Vigilance, and this will pump the power of your whole board some of the time. It seems like a signpost uncommon that will put you in its colors reasonably often. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Dennick Pious Apprentice, which for a white and a blue is a 2/3 legendary human soldier at rare. It's got lifelink, and cards in graveyards can't be the target of spells or abilities. And he has Disturb, another new mechanic where you can pay a cost when the creature's in your graveyard, and then it transforms and comes back into play. In this case, if you use the Disturb, he comes back as Dennick Pious Apparition, which is a 3/2 flyer that says whenever one or more creature cards are put into graveyards from anywhere, investigate. This ability triggers only once each turn, and investigate means you make a clue artifact token, and you can pay 2 generic and sack it to draw a card. And all of these cards that have Disturb, and it's a good thing they have it because it'd be busted otherwise, they all say when it goes to the graveyard from anywhere, you exile it. So you can't do it more than once, which would be crazy. So we start out here with a 2-mana 2/3 with lifelink that protects the graveyard, and that's alright, that's probably good enough for a C+. So adding on an entire card worth of additional value in the form of Disturb is a pretty big deal, especially because that card is so awesome. A 3/2 flyer is a real threat, and the ability to generate clues is especially powerful, as each clue you make is another card worth of card advantage. If you look at that side of the card, a 4-mana 3/2 flyer that makes clues would be great on its own, and this has the upside of being a 2-drop early. I think this falls a little short of being a bomb, but it's pretty close. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, we've got Devoted Grafkeeper, which for a white and a blue is a 2/1 human peasant at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, you mill 2 cards, and whenever you cast a spell from your graveyard, you tap target creature you don't control. And it has Disturb for 1 generic, a white, and a blue. Obviously, blue-white is really into spirits and Disturb. This is the signpost uncommon for that color pair, and we just saw a rare in that color pair, which is also really into the graveyard and Disturb. In this case, when you Disturb this, it comes back as a 3/1 flyer that can only block creatures with flying. This is a very strong signpost uncommon. It both loads your graveyard and pays you off for Disturb and Flashback too, for that matter. Tapping down an opposing thing definitely will matter sometimes, and then it of course has Disturb itself. In the end, you end up paying 5 mana for a 2/1 and a 3/1 flyer, plus all that other upside, and that's an excellent deal. This is a very strong signpost uncommon, one that will really pull you into the color pair. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Dire Strain Rampage, which for 1 generic, a red, and a green is a rare sorcery, and it says destroy target artifact, enchantment, or land. If a land was destroyed this way, its controller may search their library for up to 2 basic land cards and put them into the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. Otherwise, its controller may search their library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. And it has Flashback for 3 generic, a red, and a green. This card mostly screams Commander to me, but I don't think it will be completely useless and limited. For one thing, it can destroy some normally hard to destroy permanent types, and yeah, ramping your opponent in exchange won't always feel great, but by the late game, it won't matter a ton. Although, in a set with a bunch of expensive abilities you can use from the graveyard, it might matter a little bit more. Anyway, you can also use it to target yourself for ramp and fixing. However, doing nothing on your turn 3 to cast this is a huge liability. This is mostly a card that I think you'll play out of your sideboard when your opponent has scary artifacts and or enchantments, or a card you'll run if you're desperate for fixing. I'm going to say it's a D as far as a card in your main deck, and a C as a sideboard card. Next up, it's Diregraph Rebirth, which for 3 generic, a black, and a green is an uncommon sorcery, and it says this spell costs 1 less to cast for each creature that died this turn. Return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield, and it has Flashback for 5 generic, a black, and a green. So normally, 5 mana to reanimate a thing from your graveyard isn't great and limited, but this has 2 things going on that upgrade it. Sometimes it'll cost less mana, and it has Flashback. The cheaper cost applies for when you flash it back too, so keep that in mind. If you do flash it back, you're getting a 2-for-1. Now, it still has limitations that reanimation spells tend to have and limit it. You won't always have a thing worth reanimating, but this format is graveyard-centric, and black-green is about creatures dying in the first place, so doing it in this format looks far more doable than in most. Just sort of attacking with like your 4/4 and getting it traded with, and then in your second main phase casting the Rebirth for 4 mana to get it back, seems pretty reasonable. I still think the setup here is real enough that it isn't great, but I do think it's enough to pull you into the color pair at least a little bit. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Faithful Mending, which for a white and a blue is an uncommon instant, and it says you gain 2 life, draw 2 cards, then discard 2 cards, and it has flashback for 1 generic, a white, and a blue. Looting twice and gaining some life isn't a bad deal for 2 mana, and it's also kind of funny that, there's a card called Faithless Looting, which is a very similar effect, and this one's called Faithful Mending, so it's kind of a callback to that. Anyway, this will let you see a ton of cards in your deck while simultaneously helping you put things in your graveyard. It does have the downside of, not doing a whole lot immediately, but the life gain does help out a tiny bit on that front. I think the first copy looks pretty appealing in most blue-white decks. That's a deck about Flashback and Disturb, so this will fit in well there. But you don't want to stock up on too many cards that don't affect the board. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Flesh Taker, which for a white and a black is a 2/2 human assassin at uncommon. It says whenever you sacrifice another creature, you gain 1 life and scry 1, and you can pay 1 generic and sacrifice another creature to give it +2/+2 until end of turn. This is a very strong signpost uncommon. It lets us know that sacrifice is a big theme for this color pair. It starts with solid base stats, and every time it attacks, your opponent really has to take stock of just how big it might become. On top of that, it is more generally a sacrifice payoff, which works with itself as well as other cards, and gaining life and scrying is pretty nice additional value. I think this is a B. Next up, it's Florian, Voldaren Scion, which for 1 generic, a black, and a red is a 3/3 legendary vampire noble at rare. It's got first strike, and it says at the beginning of your post-combat main phase, look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the total amount of life your opponent's lost this turn. Exile 1 of those cards and put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. You may play the exiled card this turn. So this starts with amazing stats. A 3 mana 3/3 with first strike is relevant pretty much all game long, and Florian does one better by also being a source of card advantage, provided you can cause your opponent to lose life on your turn, and that's what the black-red archetype is. We haven't seen the signpost in common for black-red, but this is the rare, and it definitely pushes you in the same direction. And, a 3 mana 3/3 with first strike is going to be pretty capable at getting in all on its own, especially if you play it on turn 3. Black-red also has a lot of support for this, and doing 1 or 2 damage to the opponent won't be impossible to make happen even on turns where you can't attack. I think he gets close to being a bomb because he's a card advantage engine with great stats, but the hoops you have to jump through do knock it down a bit for me. I'm putting it at B+ for now. Next up, it's Galvanic Iteration, which for a blue and a red is a rare instant, and it says whenever you cast your next instant or sorcery spell this turn, copy that spell. You may choose new targets for the copy, and it has flashback for 1 generic, a blue, and a red. I'm not usually super big on fork effects, but this one looks like it has some potential. You do generally need some relatively low-cost spells to make use of it, but that won't be a huge hurdle in blue-red. What really makes this better to me is that it has flashback, which means you can get a 2-for-1, and that'll be especially great when you're getting removal. Again, you do need reasonably cheap spells to adequately use it. While copying big spells is more exciting, it just isn't going to be realistic all the time because of the additional mana you have to spend. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Ghoul Caller's Harvest, which for a black and a green is a rare sorcery, and it says create X 2/2 black zombie creature tokens with Decayed, where X is half the number of creature cards in your graveyard, rounded up. And it says a creature with Decayed can't block. When it attacks, sacrifice it at the end of combat. I referenced that mechanic earlier. This is the first card where it's sort of explained, and it has flashback for 3 generic, a black, and a green. I think this looks pretty nice. The zombies you get don't last forever, and they can't block, but getting enough stuff into your graveyard for this to be efficient doesn't seem too crazy. It's great it has flashback too, since that means you can mill it and still get the value, or it just means you can do it all over again after your first batch of zombies goes down. It takes some real setup, but it seems pretty good to me overall, and like a pretty legitimate win condition in black-green decks in this format. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Grizzly Ghoul, which for 2 generic, a black, and a green is a 4/3 zombie bear at uncommon. It's got trample, and when it enters the battlefield, it gets a +1/+1 counter on it for each creature that died this turn. So, like I said, black-green is about creatures dying, and this Grizzly Ghoul likes it when stuff has died, comes into play larger when that's the case. So, this starts out with pretty good stats. A 4 mana 4/3 with trample is a card that would make the cut a reasonable chunk of the time, and it will often be significantly larger than that. If you just have a turn where you attack with something and your opponent trades with it and they both die, this is suddenly a 4 mana 6/5 with trample, and that's not a crazy situation. There will of course be times where it's just a 4 mana 4/3 with trample, and that doesn't feel great. Like I said, that's probably like a C-, but it does have the upside often enough of coming into play large that it's significantly better than that. Still, I don't really feel like this is a signpost uncommon that completely pulls you into its color pair. It's strong, and it'll be good if you're in black-green, but it's not the kind of card that you see and you're like, man, that will really make my black-green deck incredible. It's just sort of another card in your deck that synergizes with what you're doing. It'll obviously feel great when it comes down as like a 4-mana 6/5. Not so great when it just, is at the floor of a 4-mana 4/3 with Trample. So yeah, I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Hallowed Respite, which for a white and a blue is a rare sorcery, and it says exile target non-legendary creature, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. If it entered under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on it, otherwise tap it. And it has flashback for 1 generic, a white, and a blue. This being a sorcery is a massive bummer. It takes away the advantage of blink flicker effects, which is casting them after blocking or in response to removal. You can still use this to remove an aura from one of your creatures that you don't want there, but that's pretty narrow. Mostly, this has 2 modes, and they're both pretty unexciting. One of them lets you make your creature bigger and rebuy an Enter the Battlefield ability if the creature has one, and the other one lets you tap down an opposing creature, which hopefully won't have an Enter the Battlefield ability. This does have flashback, and that makes it better, but I'm still not super impressed here. It's both situational and underpowered, and that's not a great mix. I'm giving this a D+. Next up, it's Hungry for More, which for a black and a red is an uncommon sorcery, and it says create a 3/1 black and red vampire creature token with trample, lifelink, and haste, sacrifice it at the beginning of the next instep, and you can flash it back for 1 generic, a black, and a red. So this is another signpost for black-red. This one is the kind of card that can help you turn on your cards that like for damage to be done to the opponent, like for your opponent to have lost life this turn, because you get a hasty creature with trample, which will obviously do some damage. But I don't love this. For a total investment of 5 mana, you get 6/2 worth of stats with a bunch of keyword abilities. Those creatures die at the end of your instep, but the life swing they give you is reasonable. You also won't always trade one of these vampires for a card, or even usually trade one of them for a card, so in a way, you're sort of lava-axing your opponent here, though obviously it's significantly better than that. There are some other useful synergies too, like the ones I mentioned about doing damage to your opponent to make other cards in your deck trigger. Still, with all of that in mind, I don't feel like this is a signpost uncommon that really pulls you into its color pair. In fact, I don't think it gets particularly close to getting there. I think it's just a C. Next up, we've got Join the Dance, which for a green and a white is an uncommon sorcery, and it says create 2 1/1 white human creature tokens, and it has flashback for 3 generic, a green, and a white. This whole set is filled with Midsommar vibes, and this is definitely one of the Midsommariest cards around. If that was gibberish to you, I'm talking about a folk horror movie that came out a couple years ago, and if you like horror, you should definitely watch it. Anyway, don't underestimate the flashback here. We've seen flashback on a lot of cards so far, and it's often inefficient, but that's not what matters. The fact remains that over the course of a normal game of Limited, you're going to get 4 tokens for only 1 card, and that's pretty nice. Just having the flashback cost to do in the later part of the game is a nice mana sink. Obviously, green-white likes tokens, so it will be extra useful there, but this is another signpost uncommon that I think falls a little short of being one that you're like, oh boy, this is here, I'm going to draft green-white. Instead, it's just a card that sort of helps you with your strategy and does a pretty good job of it, and that means it's just a C+. Next up, it's Catilda, Dawnheart Prime, who for a green and a white is a 1/1 legendary human warlock at rare. She's got protection from werewolves, and human creatures you control have tap, add 1 mana of any of this creature's colors, and you can pay 4 generic, a green, and a white, and tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. So you may have noticed, normally when we go to Innistrad, it's all about tribes, and the tribes are still there, but in a lot of the color pairs, it's more of a sub-theme, and that's true in green-white, where the human thing is more of a sub-theme. The color pair is a little more about going wide, though often with human tokens, and then pumping your whole board, and Catilda helps you do basically all of those things. So protection from werewolves is also a relevant line of text in this format, but that's not really what makes her good. Instead, it's the insane amount of ramp she can provide for you, plus the nice place to sink that mana. I mean, on her own, she's a 2-mana 1/1 with relevant protection that can tap for green or white. That's something you always play pretty happily, and her ability just gets crazier the more creatures you have. They do have to be humans, but in a green-white deck, you're not going to have to try that hard to have humans around. Pumping the whole board permanently, once you sort of reach a critical mass of mana, she becomes not only the thing that helped you make mana, but she later becomes a ramp payoff because she starts pumping your whole board, which is hopefully pretty wide. She's a pretty imposing card. I mean, she's really fragile. That's kind of the thing that holds her back, but she's still really good, giving her a B+. Next up, it's Kessig Naturalist, which for a red and a green is a 2/2 human werewolf at uncommon. When it attacks, you add red or green, and until end of turn, you don't lose this mana as steps and phases end. And this is, of course, a werewolf, and it's daybound. So that means when you play this and it's daytime, you're going to get the Kessig Naturalist side. However, if it becomes night while it's in play, or if it's night when you play it, you get Lord of the Ulvenwald. And he says, other wolves and werewolves you control get +1/+1, and he still has the other ability. When he attacks, you add red or green, and the mana does an empty as phases end. And he's a 3/3, so he's bigger than he is when he's a human. So, yeah, this is a very nice signpost uncommon. You either get a 2-mana 2/2 that can help you ramp a little bit, or you get a Lord who will pump a good chunk of creatures in your deck if you're in red-green. And that's pretty awesome. I mean, you know, when it is nighttime and you can pay 2 mana for this to be a 3/3 Lord, it's just going to be crazy. Obviously, that's not always going to be happening, but it's going to happen some relevant percentage of the time on all of these Daybound, Nightbound cards, and it's hard not to get excited about the times when that happens. This is another quite good signpost uncommon, I think. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Liesa, Forgotten Archangel. For 2 generic, 2 white, and a black, she's a 4/5 legendary angel at rare. She's got flying and lifelink. And whenever another non-token creature you control dies, return that card to its owner's hand at the beginning of the next instep. And if a creature an opponent controls would die, exile it instead. So a 5-mana 4/5 with flying and lifelink would always make the cut in your deck. It would probably be a B at worst. That's just a great French vanilla creature. But she also has the ability to return creatures of yours that die to your hand, and she hates on graveyard strategies of your opponent by exiling creatures of theirs when they die. That's a lot of action, and obviously, she's a bomb. She even impacts the board right away sometimes, where you can suddenly attack because you know your creatures will come back when they trade. And if you untap with her in play, she's going to start making the race impossible for your opponent. She's an incredible bomb. I'm giving her an A+. Next up, it's Ludevic, Necrogenius, which for a blue and a black is a 2/3 legendary human wizard at rare, and when it enters the battlefield or attacks, you mill a card, and you can pay X generic, 2 blue, 2 black, and exile X creature cards from your graveyard to transform Ludevic. X can't be 0, activate only as a sorcery. Like a lot of double-face cards, this has some really great flavor. It's also a pretty good card. A 2-mana 2/3 that mills you is exactly what a lot of decks in this format will want, since the graveyard is going to be abused as a resource. Then, when the game gets late, Ludevic can transform into Olog. The cost to transform him can be a little bit steep, but just paying 4 to make him into a 4/4 sometimes will just be worth it. And then, when you have extra mana to spend and creatures in your graveyard to exile, and Olog can become an even better creature, you're going to be really happy with your situation. I think this is a B. Next up, it's Old Stick Fingers, which for X, a green, and a black is a star legendary horror at rare, and it says whenever you cast a spell, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal X creature cards. Put all creature cards revealed this way into your graveyard, then put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order, and its power and toughness are each equal to the number of creature cards in your graveyard. This is a weird card, so if you have a bunch of mana, it can help you load up your graveyard with creatures, which Stick Fingers itself feeds off of, and putting things in your graveyard in general in this format has some value. And I think in a deck that's really hardcore into the graveyard and running a ton of creatures, this will be a nice conclusion, but not all decks in the format will really be able to get this going. There'll be times where Stick Fingers just isn't big, and you also don't really want to pump a bunch of mana into X. There will, of course, also be times where you just play it for 2 mana and you get a large creature, sort of Tarmogoyf-esque, but it's still just a vanilla creature. The floor here isn't incredibly low, but it's not that high either. And the ceiling, not really that exciting. I think this is just a C. Next up, it's Colorless, Stalwart Slayer, which for 1 generic, a red and a white, is a 2/3 human knight at rare. It's got flying and haste, and if a spell would deal damage to you or another permanent you control, you prevent that damage. And if a spell would deal damage to an opponent or permanent an opponent controls, it deals that much damage +1 instead. A 3-mana 2/3 with flying and haste is great, and that's good because the rest of the stuff on this card won't come up a ton. If your opponent really wants to cast a spell that does damage, they can still just cast it on the Stalwart, so you aren't downgrading their spells a huge amount with that. You do sort of make them have to kill Rem first, but that's not that amazing. The additional 1 point of damage thing will come up some, as you're likely to have, if you're in red, 1 to 3 spells that do damage, but it won't be a huge deal either. So this is a great efficient creature with upside that's mostly minor, but that's still good enough for a B. Next up, it's Rite of Harmony, which for a green and a white is a rare instant, and it says whenever a creature or enchantment enters the battlefield under your control this turn, draw a card, and it has flashback for 2 generic, a green, and a white. So to really make use of this, you're going to need to be getting multiple creatures or enchantments into play on a single turn. If you cast this and get 1 card, you're effectively just cycling in a very situational way, and that's not very good. You've got to draw at least 2 cards with this for it to replace itself. So the best idea here is to make creature tokens after you cast it, and green-white is certainly capable of that. The flashback part of the card makes it even harder for you to really take advantage of playing multiple creatures because it costs more, but it is nice that once it's in your graveyard, when it's there, it's a little more acceptable to flash it back and only draw 1 card if you have nothing else to do with your mana. I think green-white decks will be kind of okay at making use of this, but I think it's going to have a really ugly floor sometimes where it just doesn't do anything, and that's really hard to get behind a card like that with any sort of enthusiasm. I think it's just a C. Next up, it's Rite of Oblivion, which for a white and a black is an uncommon sorcery, and it says as an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a non-land permanent, exile target non-land permanent, and it has flashback for 2 generic, a white, and a black. It's nice that this can exile any non-land permanent, and even nicer that it has flashback. However, the cost of giving up your own non-land permanent is very real. Now, if you have some clues or zombie tokens, it won't hurt too badly, but a lot of the time you'll be straight up 2-for-1ing yourself. And that's something that it's worth doing sometimes. Giving up your worst permanent for their best is reasonable, but going down the full card is pretty rough. And note, by the way, it's a sorcery, so you can't sacrifice a creature to it in response to a removal spell and then kill their thing. If you could, it would be a lot better. The first copy of this does look like an auto-include in black-white decks. I mean, it is quite efficient. It deals with a lot of things. But if your deck isn't good at having permanents around that are worth sacrificing, it's just not going to be very good. I think this is probably a C+. The first copy is something you'll include, like I said, in most of your black-white decks. But it's hard to imagine running more than 1 just because the cost is so significant. And, you can flash it back too. So running 1 is kind of like running 2. Next up, it's Root Coil Creeper, which for a blue and a green is a 2/2 plant horror at uncommon. It can tap to add 1 mana of any color. It can also tap to add 2 mana of any one color, and you spend that mana only to cast spells from your graveyard, and you can pay a blue and a green to exile it and return a card with flashback you own from exile to your hand. This is a nice card. It's a bear that can tap for mana of any color, and that's something I would sign up for all day long. That's just great fixing and ramp. The additional flashback upside is really nice too. It'll make it easier to cast your flashback cards, and sometimes getting back some insane card with flashback will be pretty good. This is another very nice signpost in common. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Sacred Fire, which for a red and a white is an uncommon instant. It deals 2 damage to any target and you gain 2 life, and it has flashback for 4 generic, a red, and a white. This is good. It kills a small thing and gains you life, which is a good way to respond to your opponent's 2 or 3 drops. Then in the late game, you can use it out of your graveyard. And again, it's a flashback card that's not efficient when you do it, but like I've said, that doesn't really matter. This gives you something to do with your mana late when you run out of gas, and it's a very real effect. I think the whole package here is good enough to get into the lower range of premium removal. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Sigarda, Champion of Light, who for 1 generic, a green, and 2 white is a 4/4 legendary angel at Mythic Rare with flying and trample, and she pumps all your humans by +1/+1, and she has a Coven effect. In her case, if you control 3 or more creatures with different powers, when she attacks, you look at the top 5 cards of your library, and you can reveal a human creature card from among them and put it into your hand, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So a 4-mana 4/4 flying and trample is excellent, and the fact she pumps all your humans is very real in green-white. So she'll come down with a huge body and pump 1 or 2 creatures on a pretty reasonable basis. Then her Coven effect is quite impressive, and your chances of hitting a human with it are pretty reasonable. Like with all Coven effects, you won't always have the right board to make it happen, but it's going to happen often enough that it definitely matters. She's a bomb. I'm giving her an A. Next up, it's Siphon Insight, which for a blue and a black is a rare instant. It says look at the top 2 cards of target opponent's library, exile 1 of them face down, and put the other on the bottom of their library. You may look at and play the exiled card for as long as it remains exiled, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast that spell. And it's got flashback for 1 generic, a blue, and a black. While stealing your opponent's stuff feels extra good, this is basically just a glorified card selection spell. And that's not a bad thing, especially when it has Flashback, but it's not incredible either. It gets a bit of a downgrade too from the fact that Flashback and Disturb are both things in this format, and if you choose a card with either of those, you're going to end up giving your opponent some very real value when you use that card. Still, it can hit lands, and hitting land drops early is pretty nice, and of course, sometimes you'll end up stealing some stupid bomb, but again, it's basically just a glorified card selection spell. I think it's probably just a C+. Next up, it's Slogurk, the Overslime, which for 1 generic, a green and a blue, is a 3/3 legendary ooze. At rare, it's got trample, and it says whenever a land is put in your graveyard from anywhere, put a +1/+1 counter on Slogurk, the Overslime. You can remove 3 +1/+1 counters from it to return it to your hand, and when it leaves the battlefield, you return up to 3 target land cards from your graveyard to your hand. A 3-mana 3/3 with trample is a good place to start. Growing it in Limited is certainly doable, but it's not just going to happen easily. There are ways to mill yourself, and if lands go in your graveyard, that's great. Evolving Wilds is also in this set, as we'll see, and that'll be a nice little combo with Slogurk to make him even bigger. But a lot of the time, he's just going to be a 3-mana 3/3 with trample. Getting the counters to return him to your hand is mostly a pipe dream. So mostly he'll be a 3-mana 3/3 who maybe eventually becomes a 4/4 or a 5/5. There will be decks that can take better advantage of it than that, but overall I think it's just a B-. Definitely a good card, just not one that's really easy to make use of in Limited. Next up, it's Storm Skreelix, which for 3 generic, a blue and a red, is a 2/4 Drake Horror at uncommon. It's got flying, and your instant and sorcery spells cost 1 less to cast, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, it gets +2/+0 until end of turn. This is a nice signpost uncommon for blue-red. We've already seen that that's the color pair about spells, as it often is, and this is simultaneously a cost reduction effect for spells and a pretty real win condition for those spell decks. It will often be a 4/4, especially in a set with Flashback. It seems strong enough to me that it can pull you into its colors and is worth a first pick sometimes. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Sunrise Cavalier, which for 1 generic, a red and a white, is a 3/3 human knight at uncommon. It's got trample and haste, and it says if it's neither day nor night, it becomes day as Sunrise Cavalier enters the battlefield, and whenever day becomes night or night becomes day, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So the red-white archetype is aggro, but it has a little bit of a changing of night and day theme going on as well, as the Cavalier tells you. It wants the time of day to change a bunch so that it can put counters on various things. This seems like another really good signpost uncommon. A 3-mana 3/3 with trample and haste is already really good, and the ability to distribute counters when time of day changes is great. If it isn't already night or day when it comes down, it can just put a counter on itself and be a 3-mana 4/4 with those great keywords. And, that's not always going to happen, but sometimes you're just going to curve out with this and it'll be a beating. And when it's not, it's just going to get bigger throughout the game because night and day are going to be changing throughout the game. This is definitely an uncommon signpost that really pulls you into the deck. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Teferi, who slows the sunset, which for 2 generic, a white and a blue, is a legendary Planeswalker Teferi at Mythic Rare. He starts with 4 loyalty, and he has a +1 that says, choose up to 1 target artifact, up to 1 target creature, and up to 1 target land. Untap the chosen permanents you control. Tap the chosen permanents you don't control. You gain 2 life. He's got a -2 that says look at the top 3 cards of your library, put 1 of them into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. And he's got an ultimate that's a -7 that gives you an emblem that says untap all permanents you control during each opponent's untap step, and you draw a card during each opponent's draw step. This Teferi does not do an incredible job of protecting himself. He doesn't really interact with opposing creatures in any super meaningful way, nor does he make creature tokens, and that really keeps a Planeswalker from being a bomb. His +1 sort of protects him since you can untap something that might have attacked, but that's not amazing, and tapping opposing stuff also isn't great since you can only do it at sorcery speed. It can allow you to attack or hamper your opponent a little bit, but it's not great. Untapping your own stuff may be more useful more often. It's nice that his -2 just draws you cards, and the ultimate will probably win you the game if you get there, but I'm pretty skeptical you will. He'll give you some serious value, but he isn't the kind of Planeswalker who snowballs and wins you the game in Limited if he stays in play. I'm giving him a B. Next up, it's Tovalar Dire Overlord, which for 1 generic, a red and a green, is a 3/3 legendary human werewolf at rare. And it says whenever a wolf or werewolf you control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 3 or more wolves and or werewolves, it becomes night. Then transform any number of human werewolves you control, and he's got Daybound. So this is the side that comes into play if it's day when he comes down. If it's night, or it becomes night while he's in play, Tovolar becomes Tovolar Midnight Scourge, a 4/4 who says whenever a wolf or a werewolf you control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card, same ability, but he also adds X, red, green, target wolf or werewolf you control gets +X/+0 and gains trample until end of turn. So this set obviously has a lot of wolves and werewolves, especially in red-green. You know, I mentioned earlier that a lot of the color pairs, the tribal element is more of a sub-theme, but in red-green, as we saw with the signpost, it really is all about werewolves, and that makes sense. This is like the werewolf set. And Tovolar is an even better werewolf payoff than that was. Keep in mind, Tovolar counts himself with that triggered ability, so you have a real shot at drawing cards with him even all alone. Keep in mind, too, that it's an effect that triggers for every wolf or werewolf that hits the opponent, so you can draw multiple cards in a single combat. So, yeah, I mean, I think he's a bomb. You know, he needs other werewolves to really thrive, but he doesn't have to have them to be really good, and if you're in red-green, you're going to have them anyway, so I think he's just an A. Next up, it's Unnatural Moonrise, which for a red and a green is an uncommon sorcery. It says it becomes night, and until end of turn, target creature gets +1/+0 and gains trample, and whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, draw a card, and it's got flashback for 2 generic, a red, and a green. The idea here is if you're in red-green, you can make it night and transform all of your werewolves, and there will certainly be times where that's devastating. The small stats boost and trample matter too, especially because it can draw you a card, allowing you to let this card replace itself, which is especially nice because sometimes you have to go down a card for an effect like this. And then it has flashback, which means it can all happen again. Obviously, you have to have lots of creatures who are nightbound for this to really do its job, but because this is red-green, it seems pretty likely you'll have at least 5 of those, most drafts, without even trying, and that's probably enough. There will also be times where making it night doesn't really make a difference, but it still sort of replaces itself, and that is passable. This definitely has potential to in-game sometimes. It'll also have occurrences where it does very, very little. And I think that whole, really low floor, reasonably high ceiling thing means it's not really much more than a C. Next up, it's Vadric, Astral Archmage, which for 1 generic, a blue and a red, is a 1/2 human wizard at rare, legendary. If it's neither day nor night, it becomes day as Vadric Astral Archmage enters the battlefield. Instant and sorcery spells you cast cost X less to cast, where X is Vadric's power. And whenever day becomes night or night becomes day, you put a counter on Vadric. So 3 mana for a 1/2 that reduces the cost of instants and sorceries isn't a terrible deal in a spell-heavy deck, and this has all kinds of upside. If you play this on turn 3, it often won't be day or night yet, so when you play it in that situation, it'll be a 2/3 that reduces the cost of spells by 2, which is pretty silly in the early game. And the longer the game goes, the more Vadric will reduce the cost of spells, and there are diminishing returns on that because you're going to have increasing amounts of mana, and it's not going to be as necessary, but he does continually get larger, and that definitely matters. He starts out pretty darn fragile and needs a decent spell deck to really thrive, but that last part isn't a huge challenge with spells as the blue-red archetype. This will definitely sometimes feel like it's a straight-up bomb, like when you play it on turn 3 and it sticks around, but getting it later in the game isn't nearly as impressive. I think this is a B. Next up, it's Vampire Socialite, which for a black and a red is a 2/2 Vampire Noble. At uncommon, it's got Menace, and when it enters the battlefield, if an opponent lost life this turn, you put a +1/+1 counter on each other vampire you control. And as long as an opponent lost life this turn, each other vampire you control enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. The baseline of a 2-mana 2/2 with Menace is a good starting point, and then you add in all the Vampire and Bloodthirst upside, and you have a pretty nice signpost in common. One really nice thing here is that you get paid off if you already have Vampires in play when you play it, and if you play it first. This looks like a strong signpost in common, one that might be worth taking with a first pick sometimes. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Wake to Slaughter, which for 3 generic, a black, and a red is a rare sorcery, and it says choose up to 2 target creature cards in your graveyard. An opponent chooses one of them. Return that card to your hand, return the other to the battlefield under your control, it gains haste, exile it at the beginning of the next upkeep, and it has flashback for 4 generic, a black, and a red. Sometimes this is going to give your opponent a very hard choice. They have to choose between giving you the better thing right away and giving it haste, which probably means taking damage, or returning the better thing to your hand so that they don't have to deal with it right away, but it will become a more permanent problem on a future turn. Now, the problem is, sometimes the choice just won't be difficult for your opponent, and sometimes you won't have good things to get back with it, but I think this will pan out reasonably often. Flashback it has is also pretty nice, as if your graveyard is really well stocked, you can cast this on back-to-back turns, which has the potential to really break your opponent. Now, it doesn't quite give you a 2-for-1 upfront most of the time, since the creature that goes on the battlefield eventually gets exiled, but it is also giving you more than a 1-for-1. After you flash it back, it will feel like a 3-for-1 altogether. Still, the setup, and in particular the need for ideal creatures, at least 2 at a time that are pretty good, in your graveyard, does hold it back some. The times where you can't make your opponent have a hard choice are going to feel really bad, giving it a C+. Next, it's our last multicolored card, which is Winterthorn Blessing, which for a green and a blue is an uncommon sorcery, and it says put a +1/+1 counter on up to 1 target creature you control, tap up to 1 target creature you don't control, and that creature doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step, and it has flashback for 1 generic, a green, and a blue. We've already seen that blue-green really likes flashback, and this is another signpost uncommon that has it. And this looks pretty solid. Pumping a creature and tapping down another one for a turn cycle is a pretty good deal for the mana. You do need to be careful about when you cast this, because if your opponent kills the creature you target with the first part, it can be a bummer. The good news is that the second part of the card will still happen in that scenario, but it's still kind of a bummer. The fact it's cheap up front and has cheap flashback is really nice too, as casting it twice in the same turn is the sort of thing that will close out a game out of nowhere between the better stats and tap down blockers. This looks like a pretty nice card for blue-green decks, but it's not a signpost uncommon that really pulls you into the color pair all on its own, but it's going to be pretty nice if you're like an aggressive blue-green deck. It's just going to be ending games for you. I'm giving it a C+. Let's move now to artifacts, where the first card is the Celestus, which for 3 colorless mana is a rare legendary artifact. And it says, if it's neither day nor night, it becomes day as the Celestus enters the battlefield. It's also a mana rock that you can tap to add 1 mana of any color, and it has an activated ability where you can pay 3 generic and tap it, and it says if it's night, it becomes day, otherwise it becomes night. Activate only as a sorcery. And it says whenever day becomes night or night becomes day, you gain 1 life, you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card. So this is a mana rock with all kinds of other text. In most formats, you don't end up playing a 3-mana mana rock like this, but because this one has so much other upside, I think you end up playing it in a lot of decks. It can change night to day on the spot and vice versa. In this format, this will frequently have some effect on the board state, and the fact that when you do this, it lets you gain a life and loot, basically tacks that effect onto that activated ability. So yeah, fixing, card selection, and tampering with day and night however it suits you results in this being pretty good. If this format ends up being really fast, it won't be very good, but my impression right now is that it won't be particularly fast. A format that has flashback and disturb definitely seems like it's going to be more mid-rangey to slow. And I think that means this is probably going to be a B. Next up, it's Crossroads Candle Guide, which for 4 colorless is a 3/4 Scarecrow artifact at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you exile up to 1 target card from a graveyard, and you can pay 2 mana to add 1 mana of any color. This is like the classic definition of a D. You'll play it if you're desperate for a creature or fixing, but you really hope you don't have to, because it doesn't do either thing well. The graveyard hate is a nice bonus, but not enough to make it more than a D. Next up, it's Jack-O-Lantern, which for 1 mana is a common artifact. You can pay 1 and tap it to sack it and exile up to 1 target card from a graveyard, draw a card, and it also has an activated ability from the graveyard, where you can pay 1 generic and exile it from your graveyard to add 1 mana of any color. Well, if this set wasn't screaming Halloween at you already, especially after we just looked at Crossroads Candle Guide, it certainly is now. This card looks kind of alright for limited. Exiling a problem card in a graveyard and drawing a card for a total investment of 2 mana really isn't that bad in a format with lots of problem cards and graveyards. And then it's fixing from your graveyard, which seems fine. In a lot of ways, I think it's just better than the Crossroads Candle Guide. It does the job better because it hates on the graveyard and gives you fixing, but also replaces itself. I definitely don't think you always run this, but it seems like it will be your 23rd card sometimes, especially if you're interested in the fixing. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Moonsilver Key, which for 2 generic mana is an uncommon artifact. You can pay 1 and tap it to search your library for an artifact card with a mana ability or a basic land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. This gives you fixing, and one's often in the market for that in limited, since splashing bombs or premium removal is usually a good idea. You won't have many artifacts to get with the key, though there are a few of them, including the Celestus, which we just saw a minute ago. This is just decent fixing to have around overall, though. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Mystic Skull, which for 2 generic mana is an uncommon artifact. You can pay 1 and tap it to add 1 mana of any color, or you can pay 5 and tap it to transform it into Mystic Monstrosity, a 5/6 that says lands you control have tap, add 1 mana of any color. 2 mana for an artifact that filters is really bad. If that's all this was, it would be an F. You just end up paying extra mana to splash a color, and the card does literally nothing else, and that just ends up not being worth an entire card. Obviously, though, this is Innistrad, so this can transform into a scary thing, this Mystic Monstrosity. The monstrosity not only has some pretty nice stats, it also provides really good fixing. This is neat because filtering, like I said, usually isn't very good in limited, though it can help you out in a pinch. So the fact this turns into much better fixing and maybe even a large creature that's a win condition in the later part of the game is pretty cool. Your total investment of 7 mana is a bit steep for a 5/6, of course, but it isn't crazy either, and you pay it installments. Note too that this can be transformed at instant speed, something that certainly matters. So this is an interesting card because, usually these filter rocks are just terrible, but I think when you have this upside attached to it, it ends up being a pretty decent card. I still don't think it's great, because it's going to be kind of bad in the early game, but this Mystic Monstrosity upside is enough to make this card a C+ for me. Next up, it's Pithing Needle, which for 1 generic mana is a rare artifact. When it enters the battlefield, you choose a card name, and activated abilities of sources with the chosen name can't be activated unless they're mana abilities. This is a great card for constructed sideboards, but it's terrible and limited. Your opponent won't frequently have a card worth naming, and even when they do, the card is hardly worth it because it will only shut down some small part of most cards in limited, and that's not worth spending a card on most of the time. It does shut down Planeswalkers entirely, but again, not really something you're going to see a lot of in limited. It's an F. Next up, it's Silver Bolt, which for 1 generic is a common artifact. You can pay 3, tap it, and sack it to deal 3 damage to target creature. If a werewolf is dealt damage this way, destroy it. So if you need removal really badly, you'll play this in your main deck where it can be kind of passable. This is because, it won't be very efficient against a lot of people, but it will be able to kill their small things if that's what you need. And then sometimes you're going to run into werewolves, and this will actually basically be a premium removal spell against people playing werewolves. So I think you can play it like as a C- in your main deck. You kind of hope you leave it in your sideboard, if you're playing best of 3, because if you do, it means your deck has better removal in it. But it's definitely something you're going to want to side in against werewolf decks, because against them, like I said, it's premium removal, and that's like a B-. Next up, it's Stuffed Bear, which for 2 generic mana is a common artifact, and you can pay 2, and it becomes a 4/4 green bear artifact creature token until end of turn. This set has virtually no artifact theme. If it did, maybe the bear would be a little more interesting. As it is, it's a creature that you have to pay mana for every turn to actually make it into a creature, and while that activation isn't so bad the first couple of times, you eventually end up having to pay a ton of mana for this to actually be a card on the board that matters, because it does literally nothing if you're not pumping mana into it. I think it's a D. All right, we're going to move to lands now. First up, there is the rare land cycle in this set. They're all like Deserted Beach. They're for the allied color pairs, and they all enter the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or more other lands and add 2 colors, one of 2 colors. Deserted Beach adds white or blue. And like with all these rare dual land cycles, they're good fixing, and you'll take them over most mediocre, medium cards, but you don't want to go after them super hard or anything. I'm giving them a C+ collectively. Next up, it's Evolving Wilds, which is a common land that you tap to sack and search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. This is always really nice fixing, and I tend to like it even more than the rare dual lands here, especially because it throws itself in the graveyard, and that matters in this set. It's a C+ like those lands are, but a slightly better C+. Next up, it's Field of Ruin, an uncommon land that can tap for colorless mana. You can pay 2 and sack it to destroy target non-basic land an opponent controls. Each player searches their library for a basic land card, puts it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffles. We see this a lot, and it's a card they print mostly to be used in Constructed to hate on powerful lands. This format doesn't really have those. It sort of fixes for you, but you know what else does? Just playing a land that can produce mana that's in one of your colors. This is an F. And our last land and our last card in this particular video is Hostile Hostile, which you could also call Hostile Hostile, but then, the wordplay is not as funny. Anyway, it's a mythic rare land. It can tap for colorless mana, and you can pay 1, sack a creature, put a soul counter on it. Then if there are 3 or more soul counters on it, remove those counters, transform it, then untap it, activate only as a sorcery. And when you do that, it becomes a 3/7 called Creeping In, also more fun wordplay. Also a horror construct. When it attacks, you can exile a creature card from your graveyard. If you do, each opponent loses X life and you gain X life, where X is the number of creature cards exiled with Creeping In, and you can pay 4 mana to phase it out. This card has a great name and a cool design. However, it isn't exactly a mythic rare bomb. It isn't bad either, as any land that can eventually turn into a very real card in the later part of the game is often worth it, and that's basically what you have here. Early on, it'll be a bit of a liability for your mana base, but unlike your other lands, it can turn into a creature, so that's probably okay. You can even just attack with it and phase it out so that it doesn't die while continually draining your opponent. Still, actually getting this land to transform is not a cakewalk, as you have to spend mana and a creature every time to do it, and even with all the decayed zombies running around, that doesn't seem easy. In the end, this is probably a C+. You basically won't ever cut it from a deck with decent mana, but you really don't want to go after it early either. Well, those are my thoughts on all the multicolored and colorless cards in Innistrad Midnight Hunt. Tomorrow I'll be back with a video on white. If you want to make sure you catch that video and a whole lot of other Magic the Gathering content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you enjoyed this video and think it was helpful, like it and share it so that other people can be helped by it too. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back looking at some more spooky Innistrad cards tomorrow.